Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Any of us who've lived in the Valley for the last several decades know that wildfire smoke really is a growing fact of life, and it's a growing concern. Just how bad is wildfire smoke? Is it actually getting worse? Is there anything we can do about it? Those questions were the subject of a report by our guests. The report was entitled Understanding the Challenges Posed by Wildfire Smoke in California, and our guest is Helen Kerstein. She is a principal fiscal and policy analyst with the non-partisan legislative analyst office. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. It's been a little while.
It has. Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, improving air quality in California generally, and certainly the Valley in particular, has been a big concern for decades. And while the focus has been on reducing air pollution caused by vehicles and fossil fuels, what impact has wildfire smoke had on meeting the goal of cleaning up our air?
So you're right. I think the focus really has been on reducing emissions from stationary and non-stationary sources. So things like fossil fuel power plants, our vehicles that we drive. But I think more and more we're realizing that the significant gains we've made in those areas are being, to some extent, offset by a new source of emissions. Well, not new. It's been around for a very long time, but one that's been increasing in importance in recent years, which is the air pollution from wildfire smoke.
Yeah, I know one thing that was interesting in your report, and every time I see the number, it just shocks me, right? 12 of the 20 largest wildfires, that's 60% of the largest wildfires in recorded history in California, have happened in the last 5 years. When you just think about that, that's really an incredible statistic. Why are wildfires becoming more common and more severe?
Yeah, so there are 2 main reasons. One is sort of the history of poor forest management in the state is kind of starting to catch up to us. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One of them is really that we've kind of suppressed our way out of fire for probably too long, right? Historically, in sort of the history of California, fire was part of the natural landscape, and it was a common occurrence to have fire come through kind of at a low level. And starting around 100 years ago, around the turn of the century, there really was a policy at the state and federal level to exclude fire, to put it out as soon as we could. Right. Of course, this is great for public safety, public health in the short term, but long run, it created really dense forests that are prone to, when the inevitable happens and there is a wildfire, those wildfires becoming larger and more severe. So that's one reason. And the other reason is climate change, which has become more and more of an issue in recent years. That leads to longer dry seasons. That makes for a longer wildfire season. It also leads to more frequent and severe droughts, which puts stress on trees and can also contribute to more severe and larger wildfires.
Well, just to put in context, I've done some research and I found that in 1926, the U.S. Forest Service kind of started this kind of fire suppression policy. Historically, there were about 4.5 million acres that were being burned. But between 1950 and 1999, it was down to 250,000 acres. I mean, just a dramatic reduction. And so a lot of that forest just keeps growing and growing, and it's not being burned away. Let me ask you this. I moved here like 35 years ago. And when I first moved here, I remember smelling wildfire smoke, and then we have the smoke coming out of fireplaces. And it was kind of quaint in a way. It's kind of like, growing up and camping and all of that. But pretty quickly I realized, man, this is happening over a long period of time. It's the summer wildfires, it's the winter fireplaces. And all of a sudden I started having like some breathing issues. What are some of the pollutants that are found in wildfire smoke?
So lots of different types of things. There's carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide. You can have trace metals. You can have particulate matter, fine particulate matter, all sorts of different stuff. And it varies from fire to fire. So it really depends on what's being burned. It depends on the condition of those things, how dry the vegetation is, for example, whether there are things besides vegetation burning. So if there are homes, for example, that are burned, we saw that a lot in the campfire, homes being burned, and sometimes some of the things that are produced from those those structure fires can be pretty noxious in and of themselves. So
you mentioned, I'm sorry for interrupting. You mentioned fine particulate matter. People refer to that in the know they were PM. What is fine particulate matter?
So it's usually thought of as the pollutant of greatest concern. It's this pretty small stuff. It's about 1/30th of the width of a human hair, so it's small, and it's just these little particles, and they can be suspended in the air. They can travel significant distances, and they're small enough that they can get inside of indoor areas too, especially if indoor areas aren't well sealed, and they can also travel to through your body, so they can travel to your respiratory system, even get into your bloodstream, and lead to a lot of the health impacts that are seen with wildfires.
And you're saying now that they're talking about that, I think in your report says half of the PM in the Western U.S. Is coming from wildfire smoke. It used to be 20%. So it's a huge increase in PM coming from wildfire smoke. Let me ask you this. You also mentioned in your report that the impact of wildfire smoke on air quality is episodic. I mean, what do you mean by that? Can you clarify?
Yeah, so a lot of times we look at the average, right? Like you were just citing, and that's important. But wildfires, unlike many sources of pollution, wildfires aren't just steady. They happen, at a constant amount, throughout the year. They happen sort of in an episode, right? So there might be a big wildfire that might last, and the smoke might last days or weeks. And then there might be some months, and that might generate a lot of smoke and a lot of pollutants. And then there might be some months where we really don't get much pollution. So the average level kind of doesn't give us the whole story.
It's a little misleading. Yeah. Well, up next, we're going to talk about
really bad.
Up next, we're going to talk about the health implications of wildfire smoke. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about the all too common occurrence for us in the recent years, and that's wildfire smoke and what impact that has. We're talking with Helen Kerstein. She is with the non-partisan legislative analyst office, and she recently authored a report on the challenges caused by wildfire smoke in California. Now, I'm just wondering, wildfire smoke is associated with a lot of negative health impacts. What are they?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research on the impacts of wildfire smoke, and most of them have looked at basically smoke and use of ER visits, other kinds of hospital visits, those types of things. They've most consistently found impacts, sort of respiratory type of impacts, things like more asthma attacks. There's also been some links to cardiovascular effects, so things like heart attacks. And then there have been other associations that have been found in the research as well, including pregnancy outcomes that have been poorer or low birth weight, for example. Increased mortality has also been found. So there's really a range of impacts, and smoke potentially can affect a variety of parts of the body.
Yeah, it's just, you think respiratory, that's understandable, but all these other things, like, wow, it really does add up. You also explored the effect of wildfire smoke on it's having on people's lives beyond just the health implications. What else did you find?
Yeah, so a lot of the research, as I mentioned, is really related to things like hospital visits. But sometimes there's thinking that wildfire smoke can have impacts that, they might not be severe enough to send you to the ER, but they can still affect your body. And so some of the things that have been found are, for example, when they've looked at people's performance on brain training games, they just don't do as well necessarily with wildfire smoke, the presence of wildfire smoke. Similarly, there's been impacts associated with poor labor outcomes and reduced kind of labor force participation and earnings, those types of things. So
yeah, that was one thing I saw in your report that I found really kind of startling, frankly. You said that it reduced nationwide earning from jobs about 2% a year, which is $125 billion a year from 2007 to 2019. Wow. We're not talking millions, we're talking billions of dollars in economic impacts in terms of jobs and wages. That's a pretty big hit.
Yeah, that was a nationwide. That was a study that looked sort of nationwide. But yeah, I mean, the potential impacts they affect so many people, right? So even if it only affects people's productivity to a relatively small degree, when these impacts are felt over a large geographic area, they can really have significant impacts.
Yeah, another interesting thing in your report is you were saying that exposure to wildfire smoke doesn't impact everyone equally. So what are the key factors that make some individuals more vulnerable to wildfire smoke than others?
Yeah, so we sort of looked at it, and there are sort of three main things to think about. One is exposure. Some people are just exposed more often, right? Maybe it's because of their job, maybe it's for other factors, but they're just exposed more often. Also, some folks are just more sensitive. So given the same amount of exposure, they might have more severe effects from wildfire smoke than others. And then there's adaptive capacity, right? Some people may have the ability, the resources to mitigate the effects better than others. So there are a variety of different contributors.
Yeah, and mitigation includes, like, for example, sealing your home. A lot of people think, oh, the smoke is outside. No, actually, it comes inside. And if you can't have sealed windows or air purifiers, it's coming right into your house. So, yeah, that's how it impacts that. You also mentioned, and this kind of ties into that exposure to smoke varies within populations. So, who are some of the most vulnerable when it comes to wildfire smoke?
Yeah, I mean, it really ties to those factors, right? So sometimes, it can depend on your health status. So if you have an underlying condition, say you have asthma already, it's much more likely that that's going to be exacerbated by wildfire smoke. Some folks are more vulnerable because they're either really young or really old, or those of us sort of there are certain groups that are more vulnerable. Occupation can be important too. So folks like firefighters that are on the line fighting fires and experiencing a lot of smoke, they may have more significant impacts because their exposure is just more frequent. Similarly, if you're working outside.
Yeah, and so like agriculture workers working outside, you can't do that inside. Again, exposure to smoke. It kind of reminds me of valley fever too. And it's the same basic thing that you're exposed. If you're outside, you're more likely to have negative health consequences as a result. You also talked about socioeconomic status.
That's right. And I mean, that's both because those folks may not have, maybe they don't have homes that are as well sealed, but also they may not have the adaptive capacity. I mean, that was one of the other factors that I mentioned. If you don't have a lot of economic resources, you may not be able to purchase air purifiers. You may not be able to leave an area that has high smoke levels. You may have to work outdoors because that's your livelihood. So that's a really important factor in affecting vulnerability.
So the question is, what can or should the government do to address those issues? That conversation in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're discussing the negative effects of wildfire smoke. So what is or what should the state, federal, and local governments be doing to address this issue? We're talking with Helen Kerstein. She is a policy analyst with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute, who recently authored a report on the challenges posed by wildfire smoke in California. So what are some of the approaches that can be taken to mitigate some of the effects of wildfire smoke? What can people do?
So one of the things that's good is there are a lot of things that people can do. One of the most effective is, if you can, just to leave the area. That gets you away from the smoke. But most people probably can't do that. So you can go indoors and you can try to create cleaner air spaces. And part of that is about sealing, keeping your windows and doors closed, trying to have better sealing in your home. And then also trying to run air purifiers. If you have an HVAC system, run a good, fine filter. If you don't have a portable air filter, those are some key things. Also, if you're outside, a good well-fitting mask can be really important.
The famous N95 mask. That business is, there's always seems to be a reason why you might need an N95 mask, but this is another reason why you might need one. And even leaving them was interesting. I saw that one approach is just leave, get away from the smoke. But I've been in situations where there's a lot of smoke here in the valley, and then you go to the coast, even just like San Diego, and you're still smelling wildfire smoke. I mean, sometimes if you're in California, it's hard to find a place where you're not going to kind of breathe that air. That's kind of a challenge. So what are the barriers that exist for individuals in implementing some of these mitigation strategies? What's the problem? Why is that?
A lot of barriers, right? I mean, leaving, you have to have the reason. Most of us have jobs or school or something that keeps us where we live. That's where our homes are. We can't necessarily afford to leave. And even, buying an air purifier can be cost prohibitive for some people. Affording the electricity for their HVAC system or for their purifier can be sometimes a barrier. And then sometimes we have things like, the electrical, we lose our power during a wildfire.
Right.
This happened to a number of us recently, right? And when that happens, you can't run it. So there are a lot of barriers. There are a lot of things that are outside individuals' control. So while there are many things people can do, there are limitations as well.
And the electrical lines might have caused the fire to begin with, right? I mean, I did done some programs on this, and at least in the past, they've had uninsulated wires, high tension wires going through the forest. And when they break or whatever, they cause fires, which seems amazing to me that they didn't insulate the wires, but it's happened and it's caused some problems being addressed though. So individuals can only do so much. So what are local, state, and federal governments doing or should be doing to kind of address this problem?
So this is one of these issues that's not just a local issue, not just a state issue, not just a federal issue. It's everything. And so local governments have a really important role. There are local air quality management districts that play a really crucial role here, tracking data, issuing public health advisories, those types of things. And also local public health officials are really important in doing those advisories and letting people know what they should be doing. But the state also has a role, right? We have a couple of.
You really focused on that in your report. You're focusing really on two agencies, right? The ARB and the Department of Public Health. What should they be doing? What are they doing? What should they be doing?
Yeah, so and part of the reason why we focus on them is, our office, we work for the legislature, so a lot of our focus is advising state policymakers. But the state does have an important role, and those agencies are doing a number of things. They're disseminating a lot of information. There's a new application, a new app on folks' phones if you want to download it, California Smoke Spotter, that has great information about tracking wildfires, both ones that are intentionally set, prescribed fires, as well as naturally occurring fires and the smoke that's caused from those. Issuing guidance. There's also, the state is launching a couple of there's a pilot program that the state is launching in collaboration with local air quality management districts. And that's really to see if establishing centers and funding those centers is an effective way to help people get away from smoke.
So clean air centers where people can go up there, they can get purified air, basically. Right? Exactly. So they're not their own homes or they're outside or whatever.
Yeah, so the idea would be that there would be backup generators. So if you lose power at your house, you can go there, but also there'd be filtration so the air would be cleaner. I think a lot of the challenges, we don't really know how effective they are, and part of it, how effective they actually are in practice, will depend on, do people actually go to them and use them, or do they stay there for? It's kind of hard to expect people to go to a center and stay there for a prolonged period of time. So I think we're still trying to figure out how effective, how much does it cost to run one of those types of programs, and is that the most cost-effective approach? So that's kind of an experiment the state is running right now.
All right. Well, up next we're going to talk about what else the state can do to address wildfire smoke in the coming years. What should they do in the future? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. As the state legislature and the governor begin to formulate their approach to wildfire smoke, what kind of factors should they be considering in making their calculations? We're talking with Helen Kerstein. She is with the non-partisan legislative analyst office. Recently authored a report entitled "Understanding the Challenges Posed by California's Smoke." Let me start from the top again. I'm sorry, I kind of bollocks that. I'm just going to keep going. Just go do a single shot again. We'll start again. Sorry, Helen.
No problem.
I kind of fumbled all over myself there. Okay, here we go. This is show 1225, segment 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The state legislature and the governor formulate their approaches to deal with the effects of wildfire smoke. What factors should they be considering? We're talking with Helen Kerstein. She's with the non-partisan legislative analyst office. She recently authored a report entitled "Understanding the Challenges Posed by Wildfire Smoke in California." By the way, I want to tell our audience, if you're interested in having really fact-heavy analysis of public policy issues, it's hard to find a better place than the Legislative Analyst's Office and their website. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at their website and read some of their reports, or certainly the executive summaries. You'll be extremely informed if you do. So a little plug for the Legislative Analyst's Office, because you do great work. So let me ask this question. So what are some of the additional actions that governmental agencies could take to address this problem?
Thanks so much. So yeah, there are a variety of different options that we lay out in the report. So for example, I mentioned there are a lot of different departments and agencies at different levels of government that are involved in this. So one of the things the state could do is do some more coordination there. The state could do more of these pilots. We talked about the pilot for the clean air centers. So that's the kind of thing that the state is probably, potentially positioned to do, is to help fund research, help fund pilots to figure out what are the best approaches. And then one thing I wanted to mention that I think is kind of counterintuitive, that viewers might be interested in, is potentially expand our use of prescribed fires. That's something that the state is doing, and it could be
Is there a difference between prescribed fires and beneficial fires? Are they the same thing, or are they different?
Well, so beneficial fires is sort of a broader category, right? And it includes prescribed fires, which are, intentionally set basically for these sort of purposes, ecological and fire resilience purposes. There's also managed fires. So if there's already a fire that's out there, sometimes folks will, instead of, if the conditions are right and it's not, the thinking is that it won't spread, sometimes it's managed rather than just suppressed immediately. And then there's cultural burning is another example that Native American tribes have done for, probably millennia to steward lands.
Yeah, what's old is new again. They were doing it the right way. We kind of messed that up a little bit. But yeah, though it does sound counterintuitive to actually start a fire to reduce pollution. It sounds counterintuitive, but actually that's what the research is basically showing. And also, you mentioned in your report, education, targeting individuals and communities we talked about for assistance for those folks. and then managing wildfire. It's interesting that actually people don't understand that the federal government owns more, I think almost close to 60% of all the forests in California, which is kind of surprising if they own that much, but that's also a huge issue. Let me ask you this. You noted that the state has limited funding and resources. So you have to target those resources to the place where they're most effective in dealing with this problem. So what criteria should they be using to consider how to allocate funding?
So we outline a variety of them. I think one of the key things is activities that really lend themselves to a state role. So which things does the state really need to be doing? A lot of times that's things that need to happen at a larger scale rather than at a community level. Activities where there's really a demonstrated need that's beyond what's being met right now. Things that are cost effective, right? So our money can go as far as possible. Also really targeting these vulnerable populations. As I mentioned, wildfire smoke doesn't affect everyone equally. There's certain populations that are more affected. So it probably makes sense to try to target resources there. And then if there's a co-benefit, I mean, as you mentioned, things like, the masks or even air filtration, air purifiers, those can have other benefits related to, for example, COVID-19 and other types of viruses. So
I thought that in your report. I'm sorry, Helen. I thought that in your report was really interesting. That the co-benefits think, oh, we're just solving this one problem, but actually you could be solving multiple problems, which is a effective and efficient way to use government resources. So how would you sum up the threat of wildfire smoke on the average Californian, generally, but Valley residents in particular?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a part of our lives, both because we're probably going to see more of these large, severe wildfires with climate change, and it's going to take us a long time to climb out of the poor forest health issues, but also because we need to be doing more prescribed fire. I think that's, historically, a lot of the state burned every year, as you mentioned, and that's really how our state, the ecosystem, evolved to support. And so I think that's going to be a part of life, and really we need to learn to live with it and figure out ways that we can mitigate the effects, especially on the most vulnerable Californians.
Yeah, and then when they were talking about, forest, lumber and timber industry, which is a portion of the solution, but it's nowhere near enough to address all the timber and potential fire hazards that exist out there. It's one small part of the situation. Prescribed burns are going to be a big part of it. I want to thank our guest, Helen Kerstein with the non-partisan legislative analyst office, for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-news aggregator called the Maddy Daily by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.